Hello, welcome everyone. We're getting settled real quick. Please comment in the chat where you're joining us from. We have an exciting show lined up and we will be joining our guests momentarily. All right, let's get started. Hello, and welcome to Shifting the Narrative, a 4-part live stream series designed to explore elements of our Shifting the Narrative report, in which we explored what narrative shift is and how it works. This episode is titled Being Nimble and Dismantling Counter-Narratives. My name is Christiaan Perez. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Manager of Media Strategy at the Opportunity Agenda. Glad you can all join us. Now, this live stream series is produced by the Opportunity Agenda, a social justice communications lab that works with partners through communication strategy as well as with creative engagement to move hearts and minds towards lasting policy and cultural change. We at the Opportunity Agenda understand how important it is to engage with artists, organizers, and researchers as powerful storytellers to shift the public discourse. It is with this goal in mind that we produced the Shifting the Narrative report. This report explores what narrative elements of 6 key issues: the death penalty, war and poverty, Blackfish effect, Me Too movement, gun politics, and racial profiling. By exploring roughly 5 decades of narrative shift in those key issues, we sought to identify the essential and replicable elements of the past successful narrative shift efforts. In the last episode, we talked about how to build a long-term strategy rooted in values and the importance of establishing your own frame to tell an affirmative story. This week, we will talk about 3 recommendations. First, know and analyze counter-narratives. Second, identify and dismantle the assumptions that those counter-narratives rely upon. And third, the importance of being nimble in narrative battles. To help us understand what dismantling counter-narratives looks like, I'm pleased to introduce our panel. First, we have Elizabeth Johnsen, Communications and Editorial Director at the Opportunity Agenda. Then we have Aisha Wells, Paid Leave Organizer at Mothering Justice. And finally, we have Maritza Perez, Director of the Office of National Affairs at Drug Policy Alliance. Thank you for joining us. So to get us started on breaking down the narrative recommendations, I'm going to pass the mic to Elizabeth Johnsen. Elizabeth's going to delve deeper into what it means to challenge counter narratives and how it can be nimble as we challenge them. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christiaan. My name is Elizabeth Johnsen. I use she, her pronouns, and I've been working on this report since its inception a couple of years ago, so I'm pretty excited to talk about it today. Having worked at the Opportunity Agenda for 8 years now, I've witnessed narrative change in action through the campaigns of our partners, in the changing world around us, and in our own narrative shift work at the Opportunity Agenda. But in order to understand how narratives shift, we have to understand what narrative is, and likewise what we mean when we say counter-narrative or dominant narrative. So by the way, I wanted to point out this beautiful piece of art, which is by Noah Denman. It's available on our website with 3 other works of art for download as part of the We Can Thrive Together Economic Justice Project. And you're all welcome to go to our website to download the art and use it and share it. We've been developing a lot of artwork around economic justice, which is, kind of a key piece of what we're talking about today. So I just wanted to share that. So let's get back to narrative. We at the Opportunity Agenda define narrative as a big story rooted in shared values and themes that influences how people process information and make decisions. And narratives are all around us. They appear not only in policy discourse, but also in the news media, and pop culture, and social media, and at dinner tables across the country. Very often, particularly in politics and the media, we see what we call a dominant narrative. It's the prevailing narrative that often we're so familiar with, despite how damaging or how false it may be, that it can seem difficult, if not impossible, to go up against as advocates. For example, the scarcity of resources narrative that we've seen for years in the immigration space, or the current narrative before our eyes on the role that police play in community safety, which is shifting thanks to the incredible efforts and ongoing efforts by communities of color, those directly affected by police violence, and the Black Lives Matter movement. The truth is, no matter how dominant the prevailing narratives we are up against may seem, we can dismantle them. We have seen it happen in the past, and we are seeing it happen now. So our shifting the narrative research really helped us better understand, okay, how can we do this? Today, we're going to share a little bit about this with you. Specifically, I'm going to talk about one, approaches to knowing and dismantling the counter narrative, which is often the dominant narrative in our case. And two, the importance of being nimble in key moments. So one of the case studies we examined in this report was the death penalty. This case study in particular showed us how dismantling the baseline assumptions of the counter narrative can be a very successful tactic. So what was so successful in this case? Well, advocates of the death penalty were able to develop a communication strategy that raised doubts in people's minds about the system's fairness. And this caused supporters to actually start reconsidering their views over time. The advocates consistently tied their arguments to the racial biases that they saw affecting those sentenced to death row. And this undermined the dominant death penalty narrative at the time, which was about justice and fairness. It's really important to note that fairness and equal treatment under the law were foundational values that the death penalty abolitionists based their narrative on. This is important because this is really one of our primary recommendations at the Opportunity Agenda, which is to center your narrative shift strategy on shared values. It really works time and time again, and it worked in this case as well. Sticking to these values really helped advocates dismantle the death penalty's dominant narrative. And I'm about to explain kind of how that worked. So throughout the 1980s and the early 90s, the dominant narrative was that the criminal justice system worked, that it was a just system. And so abolitionists keyed into their opponents' reliance on what was like quote unquote working and began to really directly challenge this and prod at this. In taking this approach, they were able to show that the death penalty was actually the result of so many things that were not working and were not fair in the system, specifically racial bias and racism. This was especially effective in the introduction, or with the introduction of DNA evidence in the 1990s, which was led by the Innocence Project, where suddenly miscarriages of justice were coming to public attention, along with a growing list of death row exonerees, a significant number of whom were men of color. So in the end, over this period of time that started in the 90s and led through the 2000s, the public really started to realize that we were executing innocent people, which was horrifying, and that racial bias played a huge role. And this was a direct result of the intentional dismantling of these assumptions that advocates pushed forward. So by throwing into question the counter-narrative assumptions that the system was fair and that it was just, advocates were actually able to undermine confidence overall in the death penalty. And they were able to successfully argue in many cases for its abolition. So our second recommendation today is to make a clear plan, but be ready to be nimble. And when we examine the narrative on poverty, which is another one of our case studies, looking all the way back to the war on poverty and tracing the narrative until today, we see that there were several windows of opportunity that arose where advocates really had an opportunity to be nimble and to shift their strategy. For example, a little more recently, the economic recession of 2008, it opened up opportunity for a much more populist and transformative economic narrative to emerge. That's one example we all kind of know of recently. Right now, we are at another window of opportunity for narrative shift with the unprecedented struggles, both economic and health, of our country that we've gone through in this past year of pandemic. But we really have to be careful when these opportunities arise and when we suddenly have a chance to be nimble and shift, or if there's a tipping point. Because pushing forward a narrative that short-sightedly takes advantage of the moment without building on the long work we've done or without thinking about the long-term outcome can really harm our end results. One historic example of this is actually the war on poverty and Lyndon B. Johnson's 1964 poverty tours. So these were a press blitz where Johnsen traveled across America talking to the poor about the issues he hoped to resolve. While the cameras captured his tours through American towns, including his front porch conversation with struggling families, the picture of poverty that Lyndon Johnson painted was not a racially inclusive one. Almost all of the families, as seen in the poverty tours, were white, and you can actually watch old footage of this. It's pretty fascinating. Just Google it. And he did not address the element of race directly in his narrative. So this exclusion really paved the way for incredibly harmful narratives around the Black urban poor that developed very shortly afterward. Some examples were the underclass minority, the Black culture of poverty narrative, and then later the welfare queen trope, which Ronald Reagan completely exploited in his opposition to social spending and welfare. Today, after a year as economically difficult and tragic as this past one, we have the opportunity where hearts and minds are open that we need to change our economic situation toward one of justice. And we have the opportunity to build that narrative. This narrative should support the government taking a role to ensure that Americans' baseline needs are met through safety net programs and the importance of creating a culture of care. But we must address race and the racial disparities we've seen so clearly so that we don't make the same mistakes of the past. And so our economic justice narrative can work for all of us. So I'm going to turn it over to Aisha now to talk more about this, particularly through her work at Mothering Justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I also would want to plug as well that a lot of this materials that she has referenced actually also come from our War on Poverty chapter. Highly recommend that you check that out. I should warn you though, for if you have issues around some of the problematic narratives that are prevalent around poverty issues, there's a lot of really alarming but also very concerning issues that are brought up in that chapter that frankly are reminders about the importance of these inclusive narratives. I also want to give a shout out to the fact that we have two folks who joined us, one from Brooklyn, one from Lansing, Michigan. I'm especially excited to see Safe and Just Michigan's in the house, which is actually a good segue because Aisha Wells, she's the paid leave organizer for Mothering Justice, actually is also based out of Michigan. So you guys may know each other. But Aisha, please tell us more about your work to address problematic narratives in paid leave.
Thank you so much for having me here. Again, as you can see, my name is Aisha Wells. I want to talk to you about an organization I work for. It's called Mothering Justice. We are based out of Detroit, Michigan. We are a social justice nonprofit that advocates for mamas of color. We have 4 major issues, also known as our Mama's Agenda. We focus on safety net issues, affordable childcare, Black maternal health, and what I do is paid family leave. So that is our Mama's Agenda that we advocate for. We're a grassroots organization that is based out of Detroit, as I mentioned before. So I do pay family leave, and I'm also a mother. I have a beautiful 14-year-old son. He is disabled, and paid leave is something that is not just a huge issue in and across this country, but it is also an issue within the state of Michigan, and it's a big issue that I've dealt with personally. I have had to choose between going to work and being with my son, and no one should have to choose that. Right now, we are the only industrialized country that does not have a paid leave program. So there are many issues right now that three major issues of narratives that has had to change over the years. One of the major issues that have had to change is excuse me, I'm sorry. One of the major issues that has had to change, I just need to pull up my notes because my computer disappeared. So just being honest with y'all, it blanked out. So just give me 1 second because I need to follow my notes. Sorry about that. So one of the major problems that we've had to address over the years is the problem with folks blaming them with I'm so sorry, y'all. I'm so nervous and I don't know why. So it's been very clear that society has had a problem and we need to create safety net programs. Everyone is affected by it. This is a central infrastructure issue that challenges the messages of personal blame. A lot of times there has been focus on people not being able to get through having paid family leave because of it's been a you issue, and that just hasn't been it. The other thing that we have changed over the years, the other narrative is we've created the battle for paid leave around people who has been affected most by this is Black women for middle class people, middle class white women, and we've changed that narrative over the years that it does not just affect middle class white women. It also affects Black women in and around the country. And Black women has been the leaders over this for many, many years, and they have changed this narrative from that. And then the last thing is how vulnerable we have been since COVID has started. We have changed the vulnerabilities. We have seen that COVID has completely show how this country has affected where we are today. And the last thing I want to continue to talk about is what is paid family leave initially. So paid family leave is the one key component to help families stay economically stable during times of care. Nearly every working person will have to either care for themselves, welcome a new child, or care for a loved one. Paid family leave is the basic benefit that will help families not have to choose between themselves or putting food on the table. And so those are the three narratives, and those are what paid family leave is and around the country. The last slide I want to talk about is infrastructure. Through the lens of Black mamas, we know that the facts are women of color are the backbone of this economy. We need very large public investments in care infrastructure that makes all other work possible, including care, home-based supports, and paid family and medical leave to ensure that families care for their loved ones. Another thing I want to talk about is paid leave is economically necessary to the job market, the infrastructure plans that are being created right now. We invest in roads, we invest in bridges and public transportation because they enable us to go to work and improve the quality of our lives. And it makes the economy more productive and competitive, but we have to invest in paid family leave for the same exact reasons. Just like the data that's been published in these reports, we want to make sure that not having paid leave is a government issue that has changed. Mother and Justice and the Paid Leave for All Coalition and Family Values at Work realized many years ago that we need to work hard to change the workers and employees and government and government needs to take the time to change these issues so folks can be able to care for themselves and their loved ones. Because we have to change the narrative in years of doing work to now being able to see an actual comprehensive paid leave policy coming to the forefront. Thank you all so much for having me here.
Thank you, Aisha. I appreciate you presenting all of these materials. And like I said, I know it's stressful. I just want to point out, thank you for all the love from folks on Facebook, and, supporting Aisha. Aisha's, I know you're doing a lot of work on this, and especially had a press conference just yesterday talking about the Michigan efforts. And so I just want to give a shout out as well for all the work you're doing at a state level and at a national level. This is a vital issue. Now we'll get into, for folks who have questions for Aisha, please post them into the comments. We're going to get into the Q&A right after this. We're going to transition now into a conversation about the racist efforts around the drug war. I am excited to introduce our next panelist, Maritza Perez. She's going to be talking about helping us to transition the conversation on problematic narratives around the drug war. Maritza?
Hi, thank you so much. It's great to be here to talk to people about the war on drugs, one of my favorite topics as an advocate with the Drug Policy Alliance. So for folks who aren't familiar with the Drug Policy Alliance, we're an organization that works to end the war on drugs, really in a two-prong approach, I like to think of it. So we do criminal justice reform work, but we also work for a public health response to drug use, as opposed to a punitive response. So just a little bit of background about myself. So I've been a longtime advocate. I actually got into civil rights issues and racial justice issues from a very early age. And this was due to my experience. I grew up in a really conservative small town in rural Nevada. I'm a first-generation American. I grew up in a low-income household. And I remember growing up and often feeling like a second-class citizen, and saw the way that people of color and immigrants were treated in my community. And as a child, even, I was really aware of injustice and always was very passionate about making a change. That eventually led me to law school, and law school really introduced me to more civil rights work, including criminal justice reform. At this time, I unfortunately also experienced the incarceration of a loved one, which really cemented my passion for criminal justice reform. And, for me, I knew after all of those experiences that this was the path I was going to pursue. And I'm so glad I'm doing this, because I do think that, I'm so glad that people are now looking at criminal justice reform as a civil rights issue. But I have to say that wasn't the case for many, many, many years. And what's been happening for many, many years is that we've had this really punitive, militarized enforcement side process when it comes to drug policy. That has been our response. And in fact, that policy response is rooted in racism. In fact, the very first drug laws on the books were on the backs of people of color. So the very first drug laws we saw were actually in California in the late 1800s. And these were anti-opium laws that targeted Chinese immigrants. The labor force that had been here for generations started to be threatened by Chinese labor. Therefore, they criminalized a drug that was common among Chinese immigrants. We saw a similar thing happen with marijuana, in fact. So around the 1930s, the government official who was then responsible for drug enforcement operations in the US decided to pursue marijuana, a federal marijuana enforcement strategy. In fact, before that happened, marijuana, wasn't something that people commonly used or use that phrase. People often refer to it as cannabis by its scientific name. But the government made a very intentional decision to use marijuana because it sounded Spanish, it sounded foreign, and they thought that this could, demonize both the drug and the people who use the drug. So as you can see, literally, our drug policy in this country has been racist drug policy. And unfortunately, that carried out year after year, decade after decade, with each, administration that came into power. What we saw was that people of color continued to bear the brunt of enforcement. And we also saw, a bloated policing budget that grew into militarized policing and a huge surveillance state. And that happened over decades of funding, but it was all in the name of the war on drugs. So, the consequences are very relevant today because, if you look at who's incarcerated, both at the local, state, and federal level, it continues to be people of color, and those offenses continue to be drug offenses. Drug offenses continues to be a huge driver. We know that at least every minute one person is arrested for simple marijuana possession. We know that drug possession itself continues to be a huge reason that people are streamed into the criminal justice system. It continues to be one of the top arrest rates, or one of the top reasons people get arrested in this country. And despite the fact that people of color and white people use drugs at similar rates, anybody who can look into our prison system will see that it's people of color who continue to bear the brunt of enforcement. And this is because these policies were literally built to criminalize people of color, but also we know that there is racial bias that individuals carry and that the whole system carries. So why does that matter today? Well, the thing is that, a criminal justice conviction is not just about, what happens within the system. I mean, let's talk about the fact that incarceration and having a record within itself is a huge issue, but that also impacts people outside of the system. And, some examples of that are the fact that just having an arrest or conviction record can impact the person's ability to find housing, to get a student loan, to go to school. It could impact their ability to keep their children and their family united. We have laws set up where if people are incarcerated or away from their children for a certain amount of time, the government can swoop in and take their children. If you're a non-citizen, this could have tremendous immigration consequences for you. In fact, having a drug offense leads to mandatory detention and often deportation for non-citizens. So the consequences are huge and are felt not just within the criminal justice system, but outside of the criminal justice system as well. So at the Drug Policy Alliance, we've really been invested in thinking about a different narrative around people who use drugs and around people with criminal justice convictions. And the way that we do this is by advocating for a public health approach to drug use rather than a punitive approach. I just talked about all of the, detrimental consequences that come with this punitive approach. But we really believe that people who use drugs should not be treated through a criminal justice lens, but rather should have things like access to treatment and harm reduction services should they want and need them. And, I caveat that because I think it's important to remember that not everybody who uses drugs wants or needs treatment. People have used drugs literally since the start of humanity for a variety of reasons. The government made an intentional policy decision to criminalize certain types of drugs for certain people. So we have to keep that at the top of our mind. The drug use itself is not inherently something that we should criminalize or inherently immoral. And I think we really try to live that in our policies. So I'll talk about, a bill that we've been working on called the MORE Act, just to paint a picture of what I mean by all of this. So the MORE Act is the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. This is a marijuana reform bill that we've been working on literally for years now. And last year we made history when the House passed this bill. It marked the first time that Congress voted to deschedule marijuana. In other words, to federally decriminalize the substance, which is huge because I just, explained the racial justice implications, but also how many people are actually affected by marijuana criminalization. But, in addition to decriminalizing, we also provide for the resentencing and expungement of marijuana convictions in this bill because we think that's really important from a criminal justice aspect. But then from a social justice aspect, because of the racist history of the war on drugs, we're also calling for reparative justice. So the bill would mandate the marijuana tax revenue be used to reinvest in communities that have been most harmed by the war on drugs to build up community infrastructure. Things like job training, legal services, mentoring programs, things of that nature, and substance misuse programs as well. And then the other funding streams are to really diversify the industry and provide more opportunities for people who have had criminal justice involvement. So, for us, it's really crucial that whenever we talk about drug policy and, whatever bill that we're pushing, that we keep racial justice at the center of our work and reparative justice too, just to account for past harms and current harms. I don't want to, pretend that these things are, things of the past and aren't currently happening. No, we know that despite marijuana being decriminalized across the country and more states embracing legalization, people of color continue to bear the brunt of enforcement. In fact, the ACLU report recently noted that despite similar usage rates of marijuana among white and Black people are up to 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. So we think this bill is really important and a huge racial justice bill. And I'm excited to say that we're working with this Congress to reintroduce that bill and pass it through the House again, which is, very exciting and hopefully will move the needle toward more robust drug policy reform outside of marijuana. And, I just did want to touch base real quickly on why it's so important for us to destigmatize drug use, people who use drugs, and criminal justice involved people. As somebody who advocates at the federal level and somebody who lobbies Congress, what I've learned is that we can change policy when we change our culture. For me, as an advocate, it's really important that we use people first language. Because if you think about the criminal justice system and just the atrocities that this country has committed against people of color, the reason those atrocities were able, to come around largely is because there were attempts to dehumanize people and suggest that, people were less deserving of dignity and other things for whatever reason. So it's really important that we use people first language when we're talking about people who use drugs and people who have had contact with the criminal legal system. And what I mean by that is that, you know, we don't call people who use drugs drug users, or, you know, we don't say that they're addicts. We say people who use drugs. Another example is we don't say inmate, we don't say felon, we say people who have had contact with the criminal legal system. It's really important that we continue to center the humanity of people, and you know, that we center humanity, that we use people first language, because it's the dehumanization that has allowed us to have problematic and harmful policy in the past. Yeah, so I'm looking at my notes here. Just like another thing on that is, you know, this approach is something that we use throughout our work, just the people first language. And, you know, I think about why this is so important. And it's important because when we humanize individuals, you know, we can also explain why it's important to meet people's needs, because we believe that when people's needs are met, we actually create healthier, thriving communities. You know, this is why when all of our work around divestment and policing and a divestment from punitive policies, at the same time, you know, we're also calling for an investment in communities and an investment in people most harmed by drug prohibition. And that can only happen when we remind people of our inherent humanity and make those connections, and hopefully get the opposition on our side.
Thank you, Maritza. I appreciate all that you brought to the conversation, and we're going to open the room now for questions. So if anyone has any questions, make sure that you comment below or comment on this feed with your question. I also want to also highlight the people first language. That's something that I think like it's obviously very important to think about, and yeah, make sure is at the front of all these conversations. We will also be having a conversation in 2 weeks where we will be talking about centering the voices of impacted communities in leadership positions. So just put on your calendar for 2 weeks from now. We're going to delve into that a lot more. But I do want to start us off by talking about perhaps some examples of where failures to dismantle the counter narrative has you know, hurt us in the long run. So like obviously a big part of this conversation, it's about no one analyze the counter narrative, but also dismantling the assumptions that they rely upon. Now I'm gonna pick on people, so I'm gonna call on Elizabeth to answer first, but then Aisha, if you want to jump in on afterwards, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Sure, thanks, Christiaan. I think, you know, the example I gave in the poverty case study was a good one. That, you know, back in the 60s, for various different reasons, very many being intentional, you know, the race issue within poverty and the intersectional issues there were not addressed. And we're at a time now that we really do need to dismantle the racist bedrock that many of the counter narratives are built upon. That's not just for economic opportunity, that's for criminal justice, that's for, you know, even immigration and other issues. And if we don't do that, you know, we're going to continue to struggle with dismantling a lot of the false assumptions that these narratives are built upon, very harmful and false assumptions. And I think Maritza had the second example, you know, in destigmatizing drug use. That was a very tactical approach of taking away the stigma and showing that, you know, drugs have been used for eternity, and in many cases used, you know, in a way that's not harmful. And in fact, the war on drugs was just proportionately more harmful, particularly for communities of color. And we've seen time and time again narratives that have not been dismantled because we're still, as progressive advocates, struggling against them. I think in the moment we're at right now, though, really thinking about racial justice and really getting to the core of that is very important for all of the intersectional issues we're working on.
Aisha, did you want to jump in there?
So like I mentioned also before, one of the biggest issues, or one of the things that we're really trying to change with paid family leave, is that we're the only country, the only industrialized country in the world that has that does not have a paid family leave policy. You're really just, it's allowing for folks to make very, very tough decisions, very difficult decisions about caring for their family. And so we don't want to continue to put people at economic disadvantages over and over again. We have the ability to make these policy changes. And in addition to that, we have the ability as a country to make these individual changes. You know, it's a societal problem, and we need to create a social safety net so we don't continue to do this. And we want to do that by coming together and not creating small narratives that take away people's dignity and respect and care. We have to care for our families. That's just another part of life that we all have to continue to do.
Now, Maritza, I actually want to throw this one to you next, and also then to Aisha again, because what I'm looking at now is particularly about being nimble. So obviously, we're living in a moment where a lot more attention is being given to both like marijuana, decriminalization of drugs, as well as to the paid leave movement. But of course, that means we have to also be nimble to pushing for these reforms while trying to navigate an area where the counter narrative still has assumptions that are, we have to navigate. Like talking about destigmatizing drug use in particular, there are assumptions that have been built in that we have to kind of navigate as we're pushing for marijuana decriminalization or any of the other drug use issues. So Maritza, could you perhaps tell us a little more about how you're being nimble in navigating these issues?
Yeah, I think what I said at the end of my presentation is something that I consistently try to do, which is not allow the opposition to dehumanize people or make moral judgments on individuals. I think that's really important. So, I talked about people first language. We're, always using people first language and throughout our advocacy, whether it be an in-person lobby meeting, with congressional staff or in our advocacy materials, our social media, all of that. But then, I do think around drugs specifically, we have to do a lot of just education, demystifying drug use, because we've had decades and decades, of an abstinence-only approach when it comes to drugs. And, the education that we've had, has been like, when I think about like my own education around drugs before I joined the drug policy was, in schools, we had like the DARE program. We always got this message about how problematic drug use was. And part of our work is showing that, actually drug use itself is not inherently a bad thing. People have used drugs since people have been on this earth. And just educating people about why we've chosen to criminalize some drugs on the backs of certain people in our society. Because I do think people understanding that and having that educational background is important. But we also, at the same time, have to continue to center the humanity of people, because we're talking about really decades and decades of a misinformation campaign on behalf of this government that we have to combat every single day. So it's not easy, but those are the things that we keep in mind when we do this work.
Aisha, do you want to jump in? And also, I saw a question in the comments actually asking where to post your question. Post your question in the comments, and then we'll get to them within the next 10 minutes. So please post soon if you want to hear them in the next 10 minutes. Aisha, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, one of the ways that we are nimble with sharing our message around paid leave is, a lot to Maritza's point is that we continue to make sure that we understand that it's a human problem. We all will have to care for ourselves. We all will have to care for our family. We all will have to, at some point, unfortunately have to go to the doctor and care for our loved ones. And so just understanding that this is a widespread issue that, our government and our communities and our leaders have the opportunity to change. And so we do that through just continuing to center the voices of mamas in our community, centering Black mamas, people of color, and understanding where they are in their lives and how we can help them with our community engagements.
Now, obviously a lot of these conversations based on the shift in the narrative report, and the War on Poverty chapter in particular had a lot about one of the issues around the kind of economic policies that were put forth were that they were race silent. Like they did not address, they were geared in the LBJ days, very many of them were geared towards addressing poverty, but they did not address directly the issues that are unique to communities of color. And of course, this then led to, sorry, I'm rehashing a lot, but I'll say read the whole report, but this then led to a lot of the issues later on where I'm going to use the term welfare queen. I know that's the worst term ever, but that term literally was constructed as a way of taking advantage of that assumption that was so problematic. So with that in mind, like I said, of course, plug the report again, but then also I'm curious about your thoughts around what are problematic assumptions that you think that we need to really be a lot more proactive in addressing that could lead to problems in the future or even now, that we may not even be aware of. And Maritza, sorry, I saw your head nodding, so I'm going to throw it to you, but and then Aisha, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, so I started to talk about this in my answer a little bit last time, but I think something that we're always combating is, this belief that just because someone, first of all, that this belief that drug use is bad. We know that that's not true. People use drugs for a number of reasons, recreationally, for medical purposes, for a variety of reasons. Not everybody who uses drugs is a bad person because they use drugs. Moreover, not everybody who uses drugs needs treatment or wants treatment, and that's totally fine. So, for us, it's about like not making those moral judgments, because when we start to make those moral judgments, that's how we get to situations where we, have conversations about who is worthy, of our empathy, who is worthy of benefits from the government, who is worthy of really dignity and be treated like a person. And those have major policy implications. So we're always doing that pushback. I also see this in the criminal justice reform space too. I think one assumption that we're constantly dealing with is that people who've had criminal justice involvement are bad people. They did something bad to get into the system in the first place. And that's not true. Anybody who reads, US history through a racial justice lens would understand that, the criminal justice system was literally built to incarcerate and dispose of Black and brown bodies. It's not, it's not necessarily that people who are incarcerated did something terrible. It's the fact that, we've built a surveillance state and have created laws in a system, even outside the criminal justice system. We haven't invested in marginalized communities, and that has fed the criminal justice system. So again, this is why we always center the humanity of people and people who are incarcerated, people who have had criminal justice involvement. These are people like you and I who have families on the outside, who have dreams, hopes, aspirations. And it's really important, especially as we work toward reform, both, one thing that we've been working on is decarcerating jails and prisons in light of COVID. So that narrative is helpful for that work. But also in these recent conversations around policing, one thing I find really frustrating is that even today, people will try to justify the killing of a Black or brown person at the hands of a police officer by pointing out the victim's past or all the things that that the victim did in the instance in which they were killed. And that's BS. Like, no matter what a person did, like, people are still entitled to their lives. People are still entitled to be treated like people. People are still entitled to dignity. And certainly nobody should be killed for anything that they did. So yeah, just to give you a flavor of all the things that we have to deal with.
Aisha, did you want to add something to that, or?
Yeah. So just one other thing, like just to speak it to your point as well, is that a lot of times people have thought that because you again made bad choices, that's why you don't have paid leave, or that's why you can't get time off from work. And now, again, as I mentioned before, through COVID, we saw that two households with fathers and mothers are still understanding how to navigate childcare, how to get time off, or when the entire family at home is sick. So traditionally, you think that that has come because, you know, you need paid leave because you haven't made all the right steps. But the truth is that this is an issue that, again, like I said before, it's affecting entire households, and it's not anything that you've done wrong. It's just a simple, basic need that we all have to have going forward. And just breaking down the stigma of, you know, you got to win the employment lottery in order to have these things. You don't have to do that. All you have to do is go to work. And if you go to work, you should be able to get time off to recover, to care for your children, to care for your family.
Yeah. I might just add to that, Christiaan, when you mentioned what are some existing problematic narratives with paid leave, it's still that care is not seen as infrastructure. We are really advocating to create a culture of care. And I mean, that's an extremely sexist argument that care is not part of infrastructure, that it's just roads and highways and airports. I mean, you know, that the idea of infrastructure is the foundational elements we need for society to work, for people to get to work. And that's care, that's caregiving. And so there's a real narrative push to change that, to dismantle it, because we do need to see caregiving. I mean, look at the past year, as Aisha has said, as a foundational infrastructure piece.
Thank you. Now we're getting close to time, so I see a question from the audience that actually I'll read it because it's a very good question. Thank you, Nicole. So Nicole is a journalist, activist, and PhD student in social work, and she finds that in the last of the two spaces, academics, allies, and directly impacted people generally use people-centered language. Thank you. There's the question. And center important. However, in journalism, this is less the case. Obviously, knowing that what a big role media plays in sharing and shaping public perception and opinion, how do you think we should address this beyond education? Any formal media guidelines, policy? So basically, what's your advice for kind of making sure that reporters and media in general are navigating these issues a little more responsibly? And I want to put, like I said, we're going to do everyone, but I'm going to put Elizabeth on the spot first because I know she has experience in her past life as a reporter. But then I'm going to do Elizabeth, Maritza, Aisha, and also please include any last thoughts that you may have.
Yeah, definitely. I was definitely a journalist, so thanks for calling me out. No, it's very true, and it's something I think at the Opportunity Agenda that we're working on. We do offer actual media trainings if the media is open to it. Not that journalists are not always open to being told, how to do their work. But I think one of the big things is research and just putting reports out, and that's another piece of the work that we do at the Opportunity Agenda. We do a lot of media scans to just show the problems in the wording that the media uses and the portrayals and the depictions that the media uses, and to kind of reflect that back. And that actually is kind of a cultural strategy that works very well because people then start to see, including journalists themselves, oh, wow, yeah, this is problematic and there's a movement against it. So we should change. We need to change, particularly because if their audience is not wanting to hear that, it's a money-driven industry. Two examples of media studies that we've done that have been really interesting that you can download from our website is our Power of Pop series. The first one we did 4 or 5 years ago is depictions of immigrants in TV and how damaging many of those depictions are. And we've seen a great movement, particularly with screenwriters and, writing rooms to try to shift that in recent years. But, there's still much work to be done. And we also have a Power of Pop social influencers report. But right now we're actually working on another one that's related to this live stream discussion, which is the Power of Pop depictions of poverty in TV. Again, showing, the problematic depictions. And to be honest, what we're now seeing is that there's like almost virtually no depictions, which is a problem as well. So I think doing more research is, one of the foundational ways to help this issue.
Maritza?
Okay, I wasn't sure if the spotlight meant I had to talk, but it sounds like it does. I think it would be really great if journalists and these big publications actually did have some guidance around people first language. It's just so important. I can't tell you how disheartening it is to read headlines that use words like felon and inmate. Because already you're starting the conversation from like a very dehumanizing point of view. And already I think that's making a moral judgment in some ways because of the stigma of those words. And we could say the same thing about people who use drugs, like also seeing the word addict anywhere is like cringe-worthy. It's not helpful to our policy aims when we're trying to persuade people that we need policy change. Just dehumanizing people and using stigmatizing language makes it easier for politicians and others to say that they're not worthy of X, Y, and Z. So, I think it would go a long way for journalists to just change their language. And I know that probably the pushback is, oh, well, we're just using terms that are accurate. This is what the federal government uses. I mean, okay, but I think that's kind of a cop-out. Like, it's not an excuse to use the dehumanizing language. We saw that with the immigration movement, in fact, right? Like, I remember that there was a push to stop the word illegal alien, which we could make the case that that's factually accurate because that is how it's written in the federal code, but we know that that's problematic for a number of reasons. And I have seen, journalists change that. And now, we say non-citizens or we use other ways to identify individuals. We could do the same thing in the criminal justice space, and we need to. I think not doing so is just like racist at this point. So yeah, I would push journalists and these big media companies to make those changes.
Aisha, if you want to add anything in there?
Yeah, I just think that folks oftentimes don't think about how it personally affects them when they're talking in the media. They don't think about if that's their daughter or if that's their mom or if that's their family. They're just thinking like, oh, let me, tell this story about something I heard. And they're not thinking about how damaging it is to mamas, how damaging it is to people of color by just stating I'm stating these mere facts, but you're not. You're hurting an entire group of people, and you're not showing how beautiful and wonderful these mamas are and these people are in these communities. You're showing them as these, something that is negative, and that's just not the case. We are people of color, whether we are beautiful people or people of color, and either way, it should be shown in the most positive way as you would want yourself to be shown. You wouldn't want to be shown in a negative way if you're just simply being a human, right? And just living your life. You want to still be uplifted in a better way. And so I think media, when they do that, they need to continue to keep that in mind, that they have family and it could possibly be something that could happen to them one day.
Yeah, and also plug, we have on our website, we have a social justice phrase guide, which goes through some alternative language that you can use. I recommend you check that out. Just to also be clear, the AP style guide is obviously the standard that most people operate off of, but it also helps to take the extra step to think about how to develop more socially conscious language. So the social justice phrase guide takes that into account, but also I know that there's a number of other organizations who have similar guides. I recommend you check those out as well. So we're at time, but I do want to give a quick rapid any last words. So if you I guess 30-second elevator, anything else that you want to add for our audience? I guess I'm so Elizabeth, Aisha, Maritza, and then we'll wrap.
Yeah, I just want to use my time to really thank Aisha and Maritza for contributing. We know them very well. They do excellent work, and it's just really heartening to see how much work is being done on the ground. And to remind folks that the report is available to read on our website, and that we are very much in a moment where narrative shift is happening every day around us, and we have a potential to actually create a more just and inclusive narrative. So to really think about that, to be inspired about that, and to, turn to partners like who we have here for advice or guidance if needed. Thank you.
And yeah, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to be on the opportunity agenda. It's been a wonderful experience, and it's definitely, hopefully, I've been able to change someone's view on why paid family leave is such an important part of our society and why we need it today. We are definitely still struggling through a pandemic in some parts of the country. And so having this time and having this ability to be economically stable during this time is such a very, very important thing. So thank you for being here and thank you for listening.
Likewise, thank you for having me as part of this conversation. This is really great. For the audience, I would just remind people that, you are an influencer within your circles, within your friends and family, at your workplace. And I think you should take what you learned today and, practice that. So, call people out if they're not using people first language. That's really how you can that's how you start to change hearts and minds and really start to make that cultural shift to help us who are doing this work on the ground. Because when people start to change the language and change the narrative around these issues, that could help us actually make big policy structural change. And you could be very helpful with that by just doing little things, by correcting people when they're using the wrong terminology, or just diving further into issues and explaining more context around the issue for people. I mean, you heard about paid family leave today, you heard about criminal justice, and I just hope that you take what you learned today into your personal conversations in your personal life.
Thank you again to everyone for joining. Feel free to go to our website and check out the Shifting the Narrative report, as you see the URL that's going down there. And obviously, go back to our website to check out other materials that we have. And this recording will be available, so feel free to share it with anyone you think it might be helpful for. And then also be sure to join us for the next week's episode, 2 weeks from now, where we'll be talking about centering impacted voices in positions of leadership. So thank you everyone for your time, and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.